In 1652, the Dutch set up Cape Colony. So
I need to take you back to 1652. That is the year in which the Dutch East India Company arrived on the southernmost point of the African continent. The spices in the east would have to come around Africa in order to get to those spices.
they didn't plan on conquering a large chunk of land. They really just wanted to set up Cape Town. And the reason for it was trade routes. They were trying to get trade routes that would go to India and Southeast Asia, right? Eventually the Dutch are going to create the Dutch East Indies, which is today Indonesia. So their path is to get across the Indian Ocean. To get from Europe to the Indian Ocean and across it, you got to go past the southern tip of Africa. So Cape Town was considered to be like this really important strategic place. So Dutch settlers go, they start setting it up. There's kind of almost a myth when white people show up in a place that the place was empty. And unless it's Antarctica, there's no place on Earth where that is going to be true, right? Not even Greenland. At the end of the day, the whole planet has been populated except Antarctica. So there is already a native population there. Just
indigenous people of South Africa, when the Nguni people arrived, as well as the Western people, were people referred to as the Khoi people. You had two groups of Khoi, the Khoi Khoi and the Khoi San. The Khoi Khoi was referred to as a Hottentot and lived on the southernmost part of the African continent, and the Khoi San was referred to as a Bushman and lived pretty much in this area that we're in today. Those people were highly intelligent. They only took from this planet what the planet had to offer. They understood what plants were medicinal, they understood what poisoned. If they killed a wild animal, that was considered sacred. If they took an eland, for instance, they'd be able to sustain a family of up to 30 on an eland for over 3 months. Not one single solitary portion of that animal would ever go to waste. If you can imagine that they were using the hides as clothing, the stomachs as water carriers, the horns as quivers for their arrows, right down to sharpening bones so that they would have arrow points for the next kill. And the great difference between them and the Nguni people and the Western people was that they never measured their wealth by possessions. Unfortunately for them, the people of the time felt that those Khoi people who had started taking the domesticated animals from people who measured their wealth by possessions, and knowing that it's easier to take domesticated animals than it is to take wild animals, a bounty was put on their heads and they were hunted almost into extinction. We have pockets of them left in this part of the world, down in the Kalahari and in Namibia and up in Botswana. But they cannot hold a candle to their forebearers. It's a very sad indictment on the people of the time. But
the native population that was living in the area where Cape Town gets set up were two groups that the Dutch identified. One is the Khoi Khoi, they called them the Hottentots, and then the other group were the San, and they called them the Bushmen. Both populations were gatherer-hunters. So part of the thing that goes off in our imagination is that Africa was populated with these gatherer-hunters. Europeans showed up and then taught them civilization, and now the world is better off for it. That's not right. So just to stop. By the way, collectively, we now call the Khoi Khoi and the San Khoisan. So if I say Khoisan, that's what I'm referring to. I'm referring to that collective group. That part of Africa, which by the way includes Namibia, Botswana, and then the southern part of Angola, did have a gatherer-hunter population. The rest of Africa, with probably a couple of small exceptions here and there, was entirely agricultural.
what had happened in the interior was that the Nguni people, all the black people that you see in this part of Africa, come from the very north of Africa, from Central Africa. Over a period of about 4,000 years, they moved to avoid, as the deserts of Central Africa grew ever bigger, they moved further and further south, reluctant to come this far south because it actually gets too cold down here. Having fought huge battles to establish their kingdoms, many hundreds of thousands of Nguni people had died as a result of those wars.
So the Dutch just happened to land in an area that wasn't agricultural. They were, in fact, doing gathering and hunting. So gathering and hunting as in they weren't farming the land. They didn't have domesticated animals. They were gathering their vegetable matter that they were consuming, and they were hunting the meat that they were eating. So it sort of fits the imagination of what we want to be for a white population displacing a brown or black population.
The people who had been brought out to farm those huge tracts of land had been brought out from the Netherlands. They were joined later by French Huguenot refugees. They were joined by German people. They were joined by English-speaking people. And those various nationalities were then going to marry across the nationalities and give birth to the people we refer to as Afrikaners. If you stop and ask yourself about that blood mix, you'll find that it's a very resilient people. If you have a resilient people and you bind them together with one very common thread, and that is a deep-rooted belief in the Bible, and you teach them a Calvinistic religion, and you inform them that everything has been ordained and it's for them, and you keep them in the Old Testament and you don't pull them through to the New Testament, they're going to grow up believing that they are God's chosen people.
One of the problems that the Dutch colony had early on is it came with too many men and not enough women. So a lot of men began taking wives from the slave population that they had conquered. And then they had this issue, what happens to the little half-white kids? And so little by little, that colored population starts to grow in South Africa. It goes by multiple different names. So Griqua is one of the names that gets adopted over time. And eventually they actually start using the term Afrikaner, which is interesting because the Boer, the Dutch who are living in South Africa, will eventually dump the name Boer and switch it to Afrikaner and basically steal Afrikaner from the Griqua, from the colored population. And so I guess they realized it sounded cool. And they just grabbed it and took it as their national identity. So if you're reading old stuff, when it refers to Afrikaner, make sure you know which are they. Do they mean the mixed kids or do they mean the white kids? In any case, the Dutch don't waste much time. Within a few years, they actually do the first Dutch Gooi-Gooi War. I think the year is actually 1659, which is 7 years after they establish the colony. And then they'll do another war that'll go from 1673 to 1677. So within the first 25 years of establishing the colony, they're already doing a little bit of genocide and attacking the indigenous population and pushing them back and taking their land. Because at the end of the day, that's in part the goal of the Dutch settlers, right? They're leaving the Netherlands, they're going to the southern tip of Africa because they want free land. They're not gonna pay for it, they're just gonna take it. They're gonna take it through violence. But they went one step further, they also enslaved the population they were conquering. Again, so the Dutch have established themselves, they're practicing slavery, they're doing farming in the land that they've stolen from the native population, but they don't really do much to expand the colony after that. Not right away. It isn't really until about 1760 that they start to, it might have been 1740, 1760 in that range, that they start to actually expand and they create what they call the Trekboers. So Trekboer, Trekboer. And what they do is they expand the Cape Colony just a little bit further northeast of Cape Town. They don't make the colony much bigger, but they definitely do take more land and they put it under agriculture and they attack more of the native population. And that's basically the foundation of this colony, this Dutch colony.
When Napoleon Bonaparte defeated the Dutch monarchy, when that happened, Britain, for the first time, she was starting to embark on her empire building, was going to take control of the Cape. She didn't hold on to it for too long. She only held on until 1802, when she gave it to Batavia. Batavia was being ruled from the Netherlands, which meant it was back in the hands of the Dutch, but only until such time as Britain and France looked as though they were going to go to war. When that happened, there was a battle at Blouberg Strand. Down in the Cape, money changed hands and British rule came to stay in the Cape. With that rule came change. In 1807, Britain abolished the trading in slaves. In 1820, she brought out some 4,000 settlers who were going to be known as the 1820 settlers. Those settlers had been chosen for their entrepreneurial skill, and in a fairly short space of time, the economy of the Cape was going to be in the hands of the English. In 1834, Britain released the slaves and then started to talk about treating them as equals. At the same time, she removed Dutch as the official language in the law courts and replaced it with English. That was too much for the real Calvinists amongst those people, and they then approached the authority with a view to moving away from the Cape and moving into the interior of South Africa, for which Britain had no use.
In 1795, the British actually take Cape Town and the surrounding area away from the Dutch. The excuse they're using is that the French revolutionary government has taken over the Netherlands. I could be wrong about this, but I believe that the timeline sequence is a little BS. I should have double checked this before I came, but I believe that the French took over the Netherlands in 1796 and the British took over Cape Colony in 1795. So I think they just really wanted Cape Colony. It wasn't so much necessarily that they were irritated that the French had taken over, but I could be wrong. Maybe I have it flipped. In any case, they take over the colony, and that, of course, inflames the Dutch because they don't want to be ruled by the English. They want to be ruled by the Netherlands. And then the British make a deal with the Dutch, and they actually return Cape Colony just a few years later. And then in 1806, Napoleonic Wars are still raging. So if their original excuse was the real excuse, they still have it, and they come back and they take over the colony a second time in 1806. The Dutch colonists decide to surrender. They realize that they're not going to probably pull this thing off, not fighting the British. And they sign a treaty. And in the treaty, the British agree that the Dutch get to keep their laws in the Cape Colony. That the British aren't going to go in there and rewrite all the Dutch laws. They're going to leave them to have a little bit of legal autonomy. In 1815, a group of Dutch do attempt a little rebellion, but the British move really quickly. It's just 9 years after they've taken over the colony. They're not going to lose it that quickly. They squash that rebellion and it doesn't go anywhere. And then in 1833, something amazing happens. So the British Empire had been committed to getting rid of and abolishing slavery. But they meant it for the whole planet, not just the British Empire. But they figured they should probably at least start with the British Empire. So in 1833, they abolished slavery. That also happens to be the year that the Great Trek happens. A bunch of the Boer, when the British abolish slavery, take their slaves and flip them into indentured servants. Here it is, it's 4 years later, and that's happening in the Cape Colony. The British have just abolished slavery, and the Cape Colony flips its slaves into indentured servants to try to keep its slaves while not calling them that. To do this, the British actually had to do a special thing because they had to abrogate their treaty that they had. Because the treaty was very specific. It said that they wouldn't interfere in Dutch law. But now they are because they're making this anti-slavery policy. And the British made it clear, we don't care about any previous treaties. Slavery is gone in the empire, the entire empire. We don't care what your local laws were. And so they just sort of trash Dutch law in the Cape Colony. And a group of Dutch decide that's too much. They're done. So they do the Great Trek.
In 1834, Britain released the slaves and then started to talk about treating them as equals. At the same time, she removed Dutch as the official language in the law courts and replaced it with English. That was too much for the real Calvinists amongst those people, and they then approached the authority with a view to moving away from the Cape and moving into the interior of South Africa, for which Britain had no use. And after some negotiation, they were assured that if they could get themselves beyond the Orange River and beyond the Vaal River, they would be free to govern themselves. And so began one of the most incredible journeys ever undertaken by modern man. If you can imagine today when we drive around in fancy vehicles and we can get around places very quickly, if you can imagine an ox-drawn wagon where you take your worldly possessions, you load them onto that wagon and you begin a journey. The first mighty obstacle you encounter in the journey are the mountains of the Cape. You have to stop the wagon, you have to carry your possessions over the mountains, you then have to go back for the wagon. You have to disassemble the wagon and carry it over the mountains piece by piece. It's only once you've got it on the other side of the mountain that you can actually then reassemble it, reload it, and continue the journey. The elderly amongst you are going to start dying, women are going to be giving birth to children. It doesn't only get hot in Africa, it snows on our mountains. You cannot help but admire the sheer determination, the courage and the steel will of those people to embark on that incredible journey in search of their freedom. After they had been traveling for about 4 years, they arrived in this section of the Drakensberg Mountains. There's something unusual and difficult about humans. They appeared to have an inability to get on with one another. And after they had been traveling for about 4 years, the journey started to split. One leader suggested that they should be going west, another one wanted to go north, another decided to come east. This is a country of huge complexities. In order to understand some of those complexities and how there should be any antagonism between Nguni people and Western people, I'd like to relay a short story to you. When Piet Retief arrived in this section of the mountains, he looked down on Natal and announced to his people that they were looking at their promised land. What he hadn't taken into account was the fact that the Zulus had got here first.
When the Dutch set up these two republics, they run into a different population of Africans. They're not running into gathering hunters at this point. They're running into established existing populations of that are doing agriculture. So in other words, it's a very different kind of war and a very different kind of displacement. This is probably a good opportunity to introduce race into this. So the law that codifies the race system in South Africa doesn't happen until the 1950s, just to be clear. But the ideas of race were already being established during this time period, in part because of what the British were doing, but also just because of the unique culture of these Dutch settlers. They're not settlers, they're conquerors. These Dutch conquerors, we should be careful with our language. Like when we go to Mars and start setting up permanent places, that's gonna be settling because I'm sure there's an indigenous Martian population. It's just one-celled organisms that live, just under the surface of the soil. Who cares? It's not like we'll be exterminating a sentient species. We've probably already contaminated the place with our probes, you know what I'm saying? So it's actually, for the record, Mars has already contaminated us. It's pretty clear that there's been a lot of Martian debris that's rained into the Earth's atmosphere. And there's actually a hypothesis out there that life could have conceivably originated on Mars. Meteor impact jettisoned Martian material into outer space, our orbit rammed into it, and then Martian life seeded here, right? That's possible. It's also just as likely that we develop life independently, but that's how much contamination has gone back and forth between the two planets. So I guess I'm not that worried. In any case, those will be settlers on Mars because there isn't a sentient life form that we know of that we're going to be exterminating. This is not settling. This is genocide, ethnic cleansing at this point, and land theft, labor theft.
When Piet Retief knew he would have to meet with the king of the Zulus, he said to his people, "I want you to wait up in the mountains until I come back from this meeting with the king." At the time that Piet Retief got here, the king of the Zulus was a man by the name of Dingaan. Dingaan must have been a tyrant. He had killed his half-brother Shaka in order to take over the kingdom. And when Piet Retief got to meet Dingaan, he was a very grumpy man. He'd had all his cattle stolen. He thought that the cattle had been stolen by the Voortrekkers. Retief said he had had no use for the cattle, but while he was journeying, he had seen the cattle, and he was happy to retrieve them for the king, provided he could get land for his people. And so Retief and his men went off, rounded up the cattle, brought them back to the king, who then was overjoyed at the fact that he'd got his cattle back. At the conclusion of the feast, Dingaan says to Piet Retief, "Can you match the kind of celebration you've just witnessed?" And Retief says to his men, "Look, these Zulus have never seen guns. They've never seen horses. If we ride our horses through here and fire a few shots in there, we'll be able to impress this king." Well, he's duly impressed. And he says to Retief, "Tomorrow when you come to negotiate the land issues, do not bring those guns and horses with you." When Retief and his men went through to negotiate, Dingaan ordered their execution. They were taken onto Execution Hill, they were executed. Unfortunately, for a biblical people, they were never afforded a proper burial. And that is the first friction between Western people and Nguni people. Unfortunately, the people who'd been told to wait up in the mountains had thought better of it. They came down out of the mountains, and not far from here going east is a river known as the Blokrans River. They started settling miles apart from one another along the Blokrans River, anxious to get as much land as they could. When the Zulus saw what was happening, they started murdering the families, which led to a battle at Blokrans. That in turn led to the murder of the Voortrekker women and children, which was the final straw that broke the camel's back. And the Voortrekkers then decided to challenge the Zulus for the territory. If we can defeat the Zulu army, this will be ours. That is when, on the 16th of December 1838, the Voortrekkers set up a laager of wagons against a river known as the Nkombi River and a very deep ditch that runs into the river. By setting the laager in that way, it meant that the Zulus would be forced to come on a frontal attack. Zulus don't fight like that. In those days, they used what they termed the horns of the buffalo. By coming on a frontal attack with spears and assegais and shields against cannons and rifles, there was probably only going to be one victor. They prayed to the Almighty to give them the strength that day to defeat their enemy. If they did that, they would keep the day holy for the rest of time. And on the 16th of December 1838, the Voortrekkers defeated the Zulus at what was to become known as the Battle of Blood River. From that day to this day, it has always been a public holiday in South Africa. And I believe, to the great credit to the current governors of this country, they've retained it as a public holiday. Now no longer refer to it as the Day of the Vow, but as the Day of Reconciliation. And that's a huge step we have taken since 1994. Once the Voortrekkers had defeated the Zulus, they set up a republic known as the Republic of Natalia. Britain wasn't happy with this. She was flying the Union Jack in Durban. The Voortrekkers in Natalia had not kept their side of the bargain. They hadn't got beyond the Orange and Vaal rivers. And that is when the Voortrekkers decided that rather than stay under British rule, they would cross the Drakensberg, even if they were snow-capped, as the one lady said in the statue to her that sits today at Retief Klip. Once the Voortrekkers had crossed the Orange and Vaal rivers, they were free. In 1852, the Orange Free State became a republic. In 1854, the Transvaal became a republic. You then had the two Boer republics. Tough life, but a happy life, a free life. That's what they wanted, that's what they had achieved.
It doesn't happen all at once. It happens over a few years, but multiple populations of Dutch leave the Cape Colony and move towards Transvaal. So they move northeast, and they establish 3 states. Separate, sovereign, independent states that are not part of the British Empire. The Orange Free State, right in the middle, that's that province that you can see there. What is called Transvaal on this map is the Republic of South Africa. And then where it says Natal, they established Natalia. Natalia is short-lived, it doesn't last. One of the reasons it doesn't last is, first of all, they ran dead smack into the Zulu and the Zulu fought them. They pull off carving out a chunk of land from the Zulu, but then the British invade and take it over and put Natalia into their already existing Cape colony. So at that point, the British own Cape and Natal, and then the Dutch have two sovereign independent states in Orange Free State and Transvaal. Oftentimes people will say instead of Republic of South Africa, just Transvaal, so they're kind of interchangeable. This presents a really interesting issue for the British because there's these two white-ruled, majority black states north of their colony in South Africa that was created as an act of rebellion. They literally are leaving the British Empire to go do their own thing. And so what the British begin to do is they start to lean really hard on those two independent republics because they don't like it. It's a security issue for the British Empire as far as they're concerned, like what happens down the road, especially because there might be another foreign power making a play for southern tip of Africa, and the British have realized it's a really strategic piece of property, they want to keep it. So there's also the fact that there's resources, right? It turns out God put all the oil in the Middle East, but he put all the diamonds in South Africa. And so at that point, the British are starting to look at South Africa with eyes, greedy eyes.
But there was going to be a twist. In 1871, two little children who'd been playing around on a farm just outside of a town known as Hope Town were going to find a strange-looking stone. By the time the stone got to Cape Town, it was identified as the Hope Diamond. It was 21.5 carats in size. The authority took one look at the potential riches within the soil and said we had better annex this area. So they annexed the area, they turned it into a separate crown colony, which they named Griqualand, and they then changed the name of Hope Town to Kimberley. And Kimberley was the name of the colonial secretary who'd been governing in the Cape at the time. So that was a little like rubbing some salt in the wound. But what could you do? You were up against the empire. It was bigger than you were. What were you going to do about it? There was nothing you could do. They took it on the chin and they moved to the next day.
To South Africa. So in 1833, we have this event, creates these two statelets. The British are then going to take things one step further. In 1879, they decide to expand Natal. So Natal didn't have, by the way, its name is Portuguese originally. I don't know Portuguese, but my understanding is Natal has something to do with Christmas in Portuguese, and they just named it Christmas. They were like passing by and they were like, oh, it's like Christmas. And they just went, pfft, and the name stuck. And so there, welcome to Christmas. I love how Europeans feel the right to just do that. You know what I mean? I love the name. It's cool. It sounds cool to me. It's just, it seems weird. Like Europeans are like Adam in the Garden of Eden, renaming everybody. So anyway, the British decided to expand Natal because Natal wasn't like this nice little thing because the Zulu kingdom was there. And so in 1879, the British go to war with the Zulus, conquer the Zulus, and then annex them into the empire. So now they have roughly the Cape Colony and the Natal borders like you see them on this map.
The next huge watershed year for South Africa came in 1879, when Britain, having brought a lot of her subjects to farm alongside the Buffalo River, which was the divide between Natal and Zululand, found that the Zulus were crossing the Buffalo River and raiding the farms on the Natal side. That was considered to be an ill discipline. How were you going to sort that out? Well, the best thing to do would be to annex them, because then you could instill your disciplines. That is when Britain went to war against the Zulus. Those famous battles, the Battle of Isandlwana, and later that night, the Battle of Rorke's-Drift, and the final Battle of Ulundi, where the Zulus eventually were annexed. The next big watershed year for South Africa came in 1881, when Britain had told the Voortrekkers who'd moved into the Transvaal that they would need to get what they termed in those days native affairs properly under control. And given that those Voortrekkers by now had started discovering alluvial gold, Britain decided that as a result of the native affairs not being properly under control, she was going to have to annex the Transvaal in order to instill her disciplines. And given that her mighty Victorian army had just defeated the Zulus, she then decides to annex the Transvaal. To annex men who carry guns and know how to use them is quite different to annexing Zulus who are carrying spears and assegais and shields. And in what turns out to be a very short war, the Transvaal War of Independence, it only lasts 3 months. One of the most famous battles to come out of that war was fought on the top of a mountain known as Majuba. At that battle, the commanding chief of the British forces, a man by the name of Colley, was killed. And that meant that the Voortrekkers were now able to go to the negotiating table to negotiate a peace on their terms. And Britain then said to them they were free to govern themselves. She would never interfere with their governance again. The only policy she would rather they did not determine for themselves was international policy, foreign affairs. Well, who would have bothered with that? They were now free, living in this territory that was theirs and battling to get on, but happy to be free. The one thing they did not have was a port, so they were not able to trade with the international community. And they decided to build a railway line from Pretoria to Delagoa Bay. Delagoa Bay is today Maputo in Mozambique, in those days Portuguese East African territory. So difficult and so expensive had that railway line become to build that by 1887 the Voortrekkers, who'd moved into the Transvaal, were on the verge of bankruptcy when they discovered an enormous deposit of gold in Johannesburg. That deposit was referred to as the Witwatersrand. If you stop and do a translation, Witwater means white water. What did they find? They found a seam of gold lying on the surface of the ground that looked like a white river flowing. And that led to the greatest gold rush the world has ever known. Men and women from every walk of life came to seek their fortunes in Johannesburg. And a young boy who just happened to be 10 years old when that great journey from the Cape began is now the president of the Transvaal. And his name is Paul Kruger. And Paul Kruger sees all these foreigners coming into that part of South Africa as a threat to his governance. He sees them coming in much bigger numbers than he's going to have of his own people. And he refers to those foreigners as Uitlanders. He says, you Uitlanders, you can come here. You can dig as much gold as you like. You will have to pay tax, but you will never be allowed to vote. Well, who'd have worried about the vote? There was gold in the ground, there was sun in the sky, gold, vote, no problem. We'll sort that out another day. But the twist came as the gold became more difficult to dig. So the men who had bought up the gold claims started to sell them off. Who was buying them? The men who had made all the money in the diamond mines. Cecil John Rhodes, Barney Bernardo, the Beitzers, all the big money men of the time. And what were they doing? Forming gold mining conglomerates. It's one thing to dig gold for yourself and pay tax. You're now digging it for someone else and you're still paying tax. And where Mr. Kruger seriously appears to have lost the plot, he's not been fair with the distribution of the wealth. That is a recipe for disaster. It doesn't matter where you do it, you will find that most of the hiccups that we have on this planet is where governments, we as humans who allow ourselves to be governed, find that the people who are governing us are not being fair with the distribution of the wealth. There's one fact about humans on this planet. As I've already suggested, not one nation has ever got to the top more than once, and no nation has ever stayed there more than for a certain length of time. Minorities cannot rule majorities more than for a certain length of time, in exactly the same way as majorities cannot rule minorities more than a certain length of time. And the hiccup always comes when people are being, or governments are being unfair with the distribution of the wealth. It's a huge lesson that we don't appear to have learnt yet. With Paul Kruger being unfair with the distribution of the wealth, Cecil John Rhodes, who is Prime Minister of the Cape, has a really good friend by the name of Dr. Starr Jameson, and he says to Dr. Jameson, I think the time has come to overthrow this Kruger government. I want you to go to Rhodesia, go and get yourself some men in Rhodesia, bring them into the Transvaal, and when I tell you the timing is right, I want you to launch a raid into Johannesburg. And what Rhodes sensed was that the miners were ready to rise in revolt. If he could get the miners to rise in revolt, he could launch the raid, topple Kruger, and put in a government of choice. Jameson launches the raid prematurely. It's a huge failure and a great embarrassment to the people of Britain. The men responsible for the raid are taken to trial in Pretoria. Penalty for treason in those days is exactly the same as the penalty for treason today. It's death. They had their sentences commuted to fines. Jameson had been extradited to the United Kingdom for trial. He'd been sentenced to a menial term of 15 months in prison. It infuriated Kruger and his people to such an extent that they then started to arm the Transvaal with the most sophisticated weapons the world had to offer. And Britain was powerless to stop the build-up of those weapons because they were coming straight into the Transvaal through Portuguese East African territory. The railway line to the Delagoa Bay by now had been built. And Kruger was buying these hugely sophisticated weapons from the Germans, from the French, and even from the British. If you've got enough money and you're going to war, you can buy weapons from your opponents. It was quite clear now that there was going to be conflict. And Rhodes, who had to resign his position as Prime Minister of the Cape after the Jameson raid, who still has really good friends in the corridors of power, says to the people back home, you need to send someone to Africa who can sort out our problems. And they then sent a man by the name of Alfred Milner. Alfred Milner had this vision for South Africa. He wanted to see it unionized. If he could unionize it, it meant Britain would have overall control, the territories would be left to govern themselves. That would please the territories, and that would please Britain. Alfred Milner met with Kruger and said to Mr. Kruger that everywhere in the Western world, if they had lived in a country for 5 years, they would get the vote. Kruger said that was far too short. He thought it should be closer to 10. With the two of them not being able to agree, the president of the Orange Free State, a man by the name of Steyn, realizing that he would be pulled into any conflict situation, called a conference on neutral territory in Bloemfontein. Kruger is reputed to have moved into that meeting with tears streaming down his cheeks. He says to Alfred Milner, it's not the vote you want. He says, it's the country. In order to get this country, he says, it's going to take 14 years. You may not vote for the president until you reach the age of 40, nor may you stand for parliament until you've reached that age. And given that the life expectancy of a male 108 years ago was 47, you were a bit old before you were going to have any say in your affairs. And it was quite clear now that there was going to be conflict. Alfred Milner says to Paul Kruger, if you don't understand, Mr. Kruger, how important it is that these people be given the vote, we're going to take it by force and we will be there after Christmas. Kruger thought, no, I'm not leaving this initiative to them. I'll have an ultimatum drawn up. And he had an ultimatum drawn up by F.W. Rates. F.W. Rates was told to tell the British authority that if they did not take every British soldier that they had landed on ZAR soil since the 1st of June out of that territory, if they did not stop moving peacekeeping forces up towards their borders, and if they didn't stop diverting their ships that were carrying their troops home from India to South Africa, by the 12th of October 1899, they'd go to war. Britain replied on the 11th, said that she could not accept the conditions within that ultimatum, and believed that the countries were at war. And so on the 12th of October 1899, South Africa goes to war against the British Empire.
By that point, they've put enough pressure on the two Dutch states that the Boers are, in fact, basically vassal states to the British Empire. But they don't like the Brits. They don't like their status as vassal states. And they're constantly in this little pushback thing that they keep doing. It's driving the British nuts. So the British finally decide to fix this once and for all. And in 1899, they go to war against the two Dutch states, the two Boer states, with the goal of conquering them and annexing them officially into the empire. The Boer War lasts 3 years. It goes from 1899 to 1902. The British take both of them out at the same time. The Dutch and the Germans, because now there's a Germany, right? Because Germany is 1871. So by this point, Germany's been around for 28 years. The Dutch and the Germans are sending assistance to try to help the Boers, but it's a lost cause. The British Empire is the most powerful empire on earth. These two little states aren't going to survive the onslaught of the British invasion. Having said that, it still takes the Brits 3 years, and the Boers do fight really tenaciously, including guerrilla warfare.
On 12th of October 1899, South Africa went to war against the British Empire. 69,000 South Africans volunteered to fight. This was not just a white man's war. It was a war that was fought by all the people of this country, black, white, or indifferent. And many loyal black servants were going to take arms with their masters. For far too long now, we've had a one-sided history where we've suggested that it was merely the Boers who went to war against the British Empire. Once those 69,000 men had volunteered, they could have been conscripted if they were between the ages of 16 and 60, but with 69,000 men having volunteered, that was as many as they were going to get. Those men had huge advantages. They were in their own country.
He was
They understood
actually
the heights of the
way
hills and the
ahead
widths of the valleys.
of his contemporaries.
They had built up an immunity to the African diseases. They were riding horses and best suited to the African conditions. They could move around quickly. They didn't need a lot to sustain themselves. They would put biltong in their saddlebags and rusks and coffee, and off they'd go into the veld. Their leadership, realizing that the British would be in pursuit of them and not them in pursuit of the British, suggested that they should dig trenches on the reverse slopes of mountains and hills. They were to dig them so deep that they could stand in them and use the front of the trench as a dead rest for the rifle. Given that a Boer could shoot a wild animal over a distance of 1,000 yards, between 300 and 400 yards, it's a point-blank range shot. They had no ammunition to waste, and therefore every shot would have to count. Any army of men at war would have to have a supply column. In the case of the Boers, it was their homes. If they needed a good night's sleep and a good meal and a fresh horse and a servant, they would go home, and they would continually be on the front as refreshed soldiers. The only men who wore uniforms amongst them were the gunners who'd been taught how to use the guns by the countries from which they had purchased them. With their huge earnings from the gold, they were able to purchase hugely sophisticated weapons for the time. This war is referred to in the history books as the first of the modern wars. It's the last of the gentlemen's wars. You can ask yourself what you think is gentlemanly about war. In this particular case, you didn't fight after dark, you didn't fight on the Sabbath, and every day after a battle was a truce day, so you could see to your wounded and bury your dead. First of the modern wars, the Boers, through that gold earning, were able to buy hugely sophisticated weapons. From the British, they had bought Maxim Norfield guns. From the Germans, they had bought Krupp guns. Krupp by now had invented a gun that could shoot a projectile out of it with a timing device on the nose cone. The timing device designed to burst in mid-air. The shell would break into pieces of shrapnel, and if a piece of shrapnel hit you, it would probably kill you. From the French, they had bought Creusot guns. That gun was going to be named a Long Tom. It was able to fire a shell out of it over a distance of 10 kilometers, which meant it was going to outrange the British guns by 8 kilometers. That's an advantage. They had purchased smokeless gunpowder. Smokeless gunpowder meant that they could hide behind obstacles, and one wasn't going to be able to detect their positions, as there was no puff of smoke coming out from behind the position they had occupied. Their leadership, realizing that the British would be in pursuit of them and not them in pursuit of the British, ordered the men to dig trenches on the reverse slopes of hills. They were to dig them so deep that they could use the front of the trench as a dead rest for the rifle. given that a Boer could shoot a wild animal over a distance of 1,000 yards as a British soldier came over the skyline no more than 200 or 300 yards away. That was a point-blank range shot, and given that they had no ammunition to waste, they were to make sure that every shot counted.
They fight really hard. They did not want to be conquered. So the British implemented concentration camps. So I don't know if this stuff is still out there, but I have definitely read research that would say things like the British are the first people on earth to use the concentration camp. They were used in the Boer Wars against the Boers. So just for clarification, the British are not the first people to use concentration camps. In fact, they got the term concentration from the Spanish. The Spanish were saying reconcentration. I don't know why they were reconcentrated, but that's what they're calling it. And they were using those camps in Cuba. Cuba in the 19th century had 3 attempts to break away from the Spanish Empire. There were 3 different wars. The Little War, the 10 Years' War, and then the Cuban War of Independence. The Cuban War of Independence is 1895 to 1898. The British attacked the Boers in 1899. In other words, the British had been watching what the Spanish were doing in Cuba and went, oh my God, I love that. Concentration camp, let's use that. That's going to be a really cool tool to use against the Boers.
You may be interested. There's one fascinating fact about Spiernkop. On the 24th of January 1900, there were 3 men on this mountain. Had a stray bullet hit any one of the 3 of them, you can ask yourself what you think might have happened to the course of world history. That is not to take anything away from the men who did die here. But the men I'm referring to are firstly Louis Botha, who was going to go on to become the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa. Winston Churchill, heaven knows what would have happened had he not been around during the Second World War. And then thirdly, Gandhi. The Mahatma Gandhi was on Spiernkop. It was on this mountain, on that day, that he got his first feelings for passive resistance. He said that he could see what the human race was capable of doing to one another, but he needed to know in the name of what. The area we're in now is referred to in the history books as the Acre of Massacre. It remains the smallest piece of ground on which more men lost their lives in a single battle than any battle fought anywhere in the world up to current time. The white stones mark the British position that was dug between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the morning. Little did these men realize, but they were digging their own graves. At the conclusion of this battle, the sides were built up the way you see them now. They then gathered all the little stones that they could from around the top of the mountain to place on top of the bodies so as to afford them a proper burial. Probably realized by now that the British are getting a serious pounding in this war. They've had a bloody nose at every major battle, whether it was at the Battle of Colenso or Spiernkop, at Volkrans, Powderberg, Margetsfontein, and unfortunately, men don't go to war to lose. That's the tragedy. And given that Field Marshal Lord Roberts' son had been killed at the Battle of Colenso, and Field Marshal Lord Roberts had taken over from General Buller and was about to retire his commission in South Africa, his second in command was Lord Kitchener. He says to Lord Kitchener, if you want to defeat them, there's a way to do it. Well, you wouldn't have to be a rocket scientist to work out that the way to defeat them would be to cut them off from their supplies. Any army of men who are at war need a supply. In the case of the Boers, it was their homes. So the order was given to burn the farms, burn the livestock, take the women and children, place them into camps. Unfortunately, they never gave enough consideration to the conditions that would prevail within those camps. And disease started to move through those camps like wildfire. 29,000 Afrikaner men, women and children died in the camps. Of the 29,000, 22,000 were women. Of the 22,000, 19,000 were below the age of 16. Whole generations were wiped out as a result of that decision. It's not a commonly known fact, but over 20,000 black people died in those camps. And what did it breed? It bred men who were going to become known in this part of the world as bitter enders. There can be nothing more dangerous to contend with on this planet than a man who's got nothing to lose. And those bitter enders then took this war into a guerrilla phase. And through one of the coldest winters ever recorded in South African history, they then continued to fight. And for Britain to bring those bitter enders to heel, she then built over 8,000 blockhouses throughout South Africa. She ran more than 4,000 miles of barbed wire fencing between the blockhouses and eventually forced the bitter enders into a corner and got them to surrender in March 1902, and the war then came to a close. Those bitter enders had to swear an allegiance to the King of England, and they were disarmed. They weren't prepared to swear the allegiance. They went into exile. Some were given money so that they could restart their lives, and the war then comes to a conclusion.
What people mean when they say the British are the first to use concentration camps is when you use them against brown people, it doesn't count. But think about it, what is a concentration camp? A concentration camp, it's different from a POW camp. A prisoner of war camp is where you take combatants and you store them until you get some kind of resolution, right? Resolution being like the war ends, we do a prisoner exchange, and everybody gets to go home. So we had POW camps in the American Civil War, for example. They're kind of a recent phenomenon. In the distant past, armies would frequently just release your prisoners, because what are you going to do with them? I mean, you can kill them, and that would happen. You could enslave them, that would happen. Or you just let them go, and usually armies would just let you go, because it was just too much of a hassle to execute you. So when POW camps first started getting used, like example in the American Civil War, it was to contain combatants. In the case of the Cuban uprising against the Spanish, it was to control the civilian population. Because the problem was that in the Cuban Civil War, the Spanish were having difficulty telling who was a combatant and who wasn't. They were having difficulty telling which Cubans were supporting the Cuban revolutionaries and which weren't. And so one way to resolve that is to round everybody up and put them in a camp. Now, some people upgraded their camps. So to be clear, when I say concentration camp, I mean specifically just that. I mean a concentration camp. We conflate terms because we're always sloppy with terms. In World War II, the Nazis had concentration camps and they had death camps. They had 6 death camps. They never had more than one of them running at a time. They would occasionally close them because either there was a security breach or they were worried it was going to become public knowledge to the rest of the world. The most famous, of course, is the last one, Auschwitz, but they also had a Treblinka and a Sobibor. I don't remember the names of the other 3. A death camp is where you go to die, right? That's the goal. You arrive, you're exterminated. A concentration camp was a different thing. Now, that's not to say people didn't die at concentration camps. They obviously did die in concentration camps. At the end of World War II, for example, the Nazi concentration camp population was dying in really large numbers, but it's in part because the German military had run out of food. They couldn't feed anybody, even their own soldiers, let alone the concentration camp victims. So they just stopped sending food, and so it caused a mass starvation event. But that wasn't the goal of the concentration camp in Nazi Germany. The goal was to extract slave labor. The goal was to have you work in a factory producing, preferably things like armaments for the war cause, which was probably a dumb idea, because frequently people were in there messing with the stuff like the rate at which the Nazis had dud bombs was shockingly high for Germany. You know what I mean? Like when we think of Germany, we think of quality equipment. The unreliability of German equipment was really high. And you're like, Do you think it's because you're using slave labor? I'll throw that out there. Maybe you're idiots. Anyway, that's the nice thing about the extreme far right. They're not known for their brain power, just their cruelty. So, for the British, the concentration camp was just civilian control. But when you think about it, the Spanish didn't even do the concentration camp first. Because if a concentration camp is basically just a prison, and then when you take it to the next step, you go, wait a minute, so it's just a prison. Then whenever we've ghettoized the population, in a way, that was a type of concentration camp, right? So you can think of medieval European ghettos where populations were jammed into these places specifically to isolate them, and they were not allowed to live elsewhere. In a way, that was sort of like maybe a mild form of concentration camp. But take what we did. We did reservations. How is a reservation different than a concentration camp? The internment camps that we threw the Japanese Americans into, no, those are just concentration camps. In fact, when you think about it, if your goal is to extract slave labor, what's a plantation at that point? So in many ways, we were a lot of the inspiration for what comes later. And during the Civil War, we had Camp Douglas. Feel free to look up Camp Douglas. It is right outside of Chicago. It's a mildly upsetting story. So there, I got rid of our hypocrisy by talking about this. So, the British conquer the Dutch in 1902. The Dutch surrender, and the two Boer states are now part of the British Empire. The British, though, can't be done there. Something needs to happen now. They need to somehow organize this politically in a way that allows them to administer the southern tip of Africa, get all the benefit that they want from it, but also control the Boer population. That's slowly starting to use the word Afrikaner to change its identity. And the reason is because they know at some point the Boer are going to push back, and they're going to resist, because they don't want to be part of the British Empire. That's why they made Orange Free State and the Republic of South Africa. They were trying to get away. So the British decide, it takes them 8 years to figure out what to do, but they decide to make the Union of South Africa, which is cool because that's USA, which I think is wonderfully hilarious. So the USA in Africa, the Union of South Africa, is going to be Transvaal, Orange Free State, Natal, and Cape Colony.